Today, we're going over AMD's last decade of processors. We're mostly focusing on the single CCD flagships, but also be going over some of the history of each generation and then showing you how it performs today in a range of modern games that allow us to see where AMD made their gains over the years. It's a really interesting journey, and I think you're going to enjoy this one, so let's get into it. AMD released its first Zen-based Ryzen processors back in March of 2017, but prior to that, we had AMD's Bulldozer architecture, which almost steamroller, pile driver, and excavated the entire company out of existence. And those were the code names for the cores, by the way. Little pun, bit of a joke there for you early birds. Anyway, the point being that back in 2015, AMD was effectively on life support. The company's stock price had plummeted to around $1.60 per share, and they were carrying roughly $2 billion in debt with very little cash on hand. And in the years leading up to the release of Ryzen, Intel held over 90% of the enthusiast and server CPU market share. AMD was essentially invisible to the high-performance space, surviving primarily on budget chips and semi-custom deals. And as I alluded to a moment ago, their previous generation architecture, so Bulldozer, which is what the FX series was based on, it was a massive failure. It was wildly inefficient, it ran hot, and it was soundly beaten by Intel's Sandy Bridge and Haswell chips. And this left AMD with no competitive product for nearly 6 years. People today laugh at the power usage of Intel's Core i9-14900K, and rightfully so. But some go a bit too far in my opinion by calling it another bulldozer. And the reason why this is too far in my opinion is because the 14900K, while it does use enough power to make an AI data center blush, it's also incredibly fast. Bulldozer had the power bill and none of the performance awards to show for it. The situation, in fact, was so bad that I don't think many gamers today know just how close AMD was to being ended a decade ago. In fact, if it wasn't for the deal to provide chips for the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, it's highly likely AMD wouldn't have survived long enough to even release Ryzen. The console royalties provided a steady cash flow needed to keep the lights on while Lisa Su and Mike Clark developed the Zen architecture. If the first Ryzen CPUs released in 2017 had performed like the FX series before it, AMD likely wouldn't exist in its current form today. AMD would have probably had to file for bankruptcy protection to restructure or liquidate. And this would have been a disastrous outcome for a number of reasons. AMD's right to produce x86 processors was tied to a cross-licensing agreement with Intel, so in a bankruptcy or liquidation scenario, that license may have been terminated or legally challenged at the very least, making it nearly impossible for a buyer to keep making CPUs. And without Ryzen, Intel would have no reason to innovate, and we know back then Intel was very resistant to innovation. For example, prior to the release of Ryzen, Intel's flagship consumer CPUs were 4-core, 8-threaded chips, and that was the case for nearly a decade. And while this might trigger some people, I'll just say it anyway, had AMD not released Ryzen in the way that they did, we could still very possibly be paying $350 plus for 4-core CPUs today. And, well, with no competition, no pressure to increase core counts or lower any prices, I don't see why that couldn't be the case. So it's really difficult to overstate how thin the margin of error was. AMD bet the entire company on the Zen architecture, and luckily for you and I, it worked. So this brings us to 2017 with everything on the line. The Ryzen 1000 series, based on the original Zen architecture, it initially launched with just 3 models. They were all in the Ryzen 7 range, with the Ryzen 7 1700, the 1700X, and then the 1800X. These Ryzen 7 models offered 8 cores and 16 threads for as little as $330 US. And this is at a time when Intel's 8-core models, they didn't even exist on their mainstream platform. You had to go to their high-end desktop platform, and that would get you something like the Core i7 6900K for more than $1,000 US. So the Ryzen 7 launch effectively cut the price of high-performance computing by 2/3 overnight. Of course, the price is just part of the equation, and while these Ryzen CPUs were certainly very cheap, they're also quite competitive in terms of performance. Now, for gaming, Admittedly, the results weren't amazing, and in many ways they were quite underwhelming, as there was a lot of work that still needed to be done to improve things like the core and memory latency. But still, the results were good enough, especially when coupled with the strong productivity performance. AMD even surpassed its own internal goal of a 40% IPC improvement over the previous Excavator architecture, achieving roughly a 50% increase. And this massive boost is what got them back on track. Helping here was the introduction of AMD's SMT technology, similar to what Intel was doing with hyperthreading, and it significantly boosted efficiency in multi-threaded tasks like video rendering and 3D modeling. Now, looking back at our 2017 gaming data, we see that the 7700K, which was Intel's flagship mainstream desktop part of the time, it was 18% faster than the 1800X. So, although the 1800X was 43% faster than the FX 8370 and much more power efficient, it was struggling to match Intel's Core i5 range, which at the time was limited to just 4 cores with 4 threads. Today though, games are more CPU demanding and do better utilize a part like the 1800X, but even so, the 7700K is still up to 13% faster in our testing when looking at the medium preset data, though with the ultra preset data, which is generally a little bit more CPU demanding as stuff like crowd density increases, this saw the margin reduce to just 8%. Overall, the initial wave of Ryzen 1000 series processors did enough for AMD to just jam its foot in the door, letting Intel know it wasn't going away just yet. Now, a year after the release of AMD's initial disruptor, the Ryzen 1000 series, they were ready to unleash the refinement, the Zen Plus generation, which fixed many of the original platform's teething issues. Firstly, there was the price drop. The Ryzen 7 2700X, which was the new flagship model, it launched at $330 US, which was significantly cheaper than the 1800X's $500 launch price. And this positioned it directly against the Intel Core i7 8700K, which was like a 7700K with 2 more cores tacked on and a 50% increase to the L3 cache. And really, the result for Intel was very good. AMD also threw in their top-tier Wraith Prism RGB cooler, which was a massive value add, as the 1800X didn't include a cooler at all, and of course the performance gains, which were achieved by improved clock speeds, cache latency, and just general memory performance. In the case of the 2700X, the max boost clock was raised from 4 GHz to 4.3 GHz, and that's an 8% increase. And this was achieved by moving Zen Plus from GlobalFoundries' 14nm process to the new 12nm LP process. A big boost to gaming was achieved by the reduced L1, L2, and L3 cache latencies, all of which were improved anywhere from 8 to 16%. AMD also improved memory compatibility with a refined IMC, or integrated memory controller, officially supporting DDR4 2933 up from 2666, and this change made it much easier to hit DDR4 3200 speeds. Looking at our updated data, we can see that on average, the improvements boosted the 2700X's gaming performance by 11 to 12% over the 1800X, which was enough to finally catch the 7700K. The only problem for AMD, though, was that Intel had already replaced the 7700K with the much faster 8700K, boosting performance by a rather substantial 24 to 27%, easily outpacing the 2700X. Not to worry though, the Ryzen 2000 series was another case of just doing enough for AMD, and while they were forced to slash prices in order to compete, they seemed happy enough to just be competing at the time, and this saw the flagship 2700X hit an all-time low price of just $130 US in November of 2019 at Micro Center. It's also well worth noting that although the Ryzen 2000 series saw AMD usher in the new 400 series chipsets, including the X470, motherboards featuring these new chipsets were not required to support 200 series processors, and instead users could opt for cheaper, pre-existing 300 series boards. Now, Intel's 8700K, on the other hand, that was not an in-slot upgrade option for those with a 6000 or 7000 series processor. In order to get the 8700K, those users would be required to buy a brand new motherboard. Then, as expected a year later, November 2019, AMD pushed out Zen 2. So we've got the Ryzen 3000 series, and this is when things really started to heat up in the battle between AMD and Intel. Zen 2 was arguably the most important architectural shift in AMD's history, as it saw the move from a monolithic design to a chiplet design, and this really was a game changer. The chiplet design allowed AMD to separate the CPU into different pieces of silicon, and this approach helped massively with scaling and, of course, manufacturing costs, allowing them to bring 16-core, 32-thread processors to the mainstream desktop. As a result, we got our first Ryzen 9 processors in the form of the 12-core, 24-thread Ryzen 9 3900X and 16-core, 32-thread Ryzen 9 3950X. These CPUs were productivity monsters, crushing Intel's 8-core 16-thread Core i9 9900K with ease. But when it came to gaming, these models did suffer due to scheduling issues, and that meant gamers were best served by the cheaper Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 7 processors. The good news is, though, these 6 and 8 core models were also greatly improved thanks to roughly a 15% increase in IPC, which was achieved through architectural refinements like a redesigned branch predictor and better cache handling, and this effectively closed the single-core gap with Intel. AMD also introduced the Game Cache, which was really just a doubling of the L3 cache to 32 megabytes. It was branded as Game Cache though because it drastically reduced memory latency, which was the primary bottleneck for gaming performance on previous Ryzen chips. It was becoming increasingly evident though that L3 cache capacity was key for boosting game performance and had a greater effect than simply just adding more cores. In fact, I made a video back in 2021 that clearly demonstrated this. The video was titled, "More Cores versus More Cache, What Boosts Gaming FPS?" And the answer was cache. And despite using Intel CPUs for that particular demonstration, I was vindicated once AMD released the 5800X3D, though that didn't happen until a year later. It was a timely video though, because the Ryzen 2 release sparked a debate online as to whether or not the Ryzen 7 or Ryzen 9 processors were a better investment for gamers. Some argued that going from 8 to 16 cores would better future-proof your investment, but given how these CPUs were designed, that didn't really seem that likely to us, and therefore we recommended gamers save the money and opt for a 6 or 8 core processor instead, and thankfully that advice has aged really well. The 3800X was able to roughly match the performance of the Core i7 8700K, seen in our updated testing, but Intel was able to stay one step ahead by, once again, tacking on 2 more cores and increasing the L3 cache, this time by 33%, from 12 megabytes up to 16 megabytes, creating the Core i9 9900K. Now, based on our updated testing, the 9900K is 16 to 18% faster than the 3800X, but at over $500, the Intel CPU costs substantially more, and as I noted, it couldn't hold a candle to the AMD Ryzen 9 parts for core-heavy productivity workloads. Not only that, but more affordable models, such as the Ryzen 5 3600, still receive the massive 32MB L3 cache, leading to strong gaming performance that easily rivaled Core i5 models, all while costing just $200 US at launch, but went as low as $150 US just months after release, whereas the Intel pricing didn't really change. This led the Ryzen 5 3600 to being one of AMD's most popular CPUs at that period in time, and for the money, it was a ripper deal. Oh, and in true AMD fashion, you could simply slot it into any existing AM4 motherboard, released as far back as 2017, with the appropriate BIOS version loaded, of course. The Zen 2 generation also spawned the Ryzen 4000 series, which was, I guess you could say, one of the more unique entries into AMD's history. Unlike the 1000, 2000, and 3000 series that came before it, the 4000 series didn't really have your sort of traditional big desktop launch. Instead, it was primarily targeted at laptops with mostly OEM-only status for the desktop parts. The 4000 series was really just based on cut-down silicon. There was no sort of special Ryzen 7 4800X, for example. These were, as I said before, mostly mobile APU-type products designed for OEM channels. They used a monolithic design, and then they supported older features like PCI Express 3.0, for example. So in short, the Ryzen 4000 series was meant to be a proof of concept that AMD could win the laptop war, though I'm not really sure how well that went for them. Then in November of 2020, so a year after the release of Zen 2, we got Zen 3, and boy were things getting exciting at this point. Zen 3 was a massive ground-up redesign of the core logic, even though it stayed on the same 7nm process as Zen 2. It provided one of the largest single-generation jumps in x86 history. It allowed AMD to finally overtake Intel in single-threaded performance, which had been Intel's last remaining stronghold. AMD unified all 8 cores into a single complex with direct access to that massive 32MB L3 cache, and this unified design, it really was the secret sauce that dramatically reduced the latency to improve gaming performance. And not only that, but despite the performance gains, Zen 3 maintained incredible power efficiency. The 5800X, for example, delivered significantly more performance per watt than Intel's 10th and 11th gen competitors. There were a few drawbacks though, particularly when discussing the Ryzen 7 5800X. For one, AMD increased the MSRP to $450 US, so that's a $50 jump over the 3800X, and this was the moment that AMD shifted from being sort of a budget alternative to the premium performance leader. But by this, I don't necessarily mean the 5800X was faster than the Core i9 10900K, because it actually wasn't. But AMD was still able to take that position as their Ryzen 9 parts were annihilating Intel in almost all productivity benchmarks. So it was kind of like the halo effect. The 5950X, for example, was around 60% faster than the 10900K in Cinebench. And believe me, Intel fans didn't love Cinebench back then. Certainly not like the way they do today, thanks to those E-core clusters. And the other downer for the 5800X was the fact that it didn't come with a box cooler. And instead AMD recommended at least a 240mm AO, or a high-end air cooler, as the 8-core chip was notorious for running hotter than the 6-core 5600X, for example, or even the 12-core 5900X. Now, if we look at the updated gaming data, we see just how significant of a release Zen 3 really was. The 5800X is right there alongside the 10900K, with less than a 5% margin separating them. They're now trading blows, and that was setting off alarm bells at Intel. But Zen 3 had one more party trick up its sleeve, and boy was it a big one. And I am of course talking about their 3D V-Cache technology, which was first introduced by the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D in April of 2022. It's a bit of a warped timeline though, because by the time the 5800X 3D arrived, Intel had already released their 12th gen series, which was a very impressive CPU architecture in its own right. In a way, the 5800X 3D was sort of, I guess, more a proof of concept, a way for AMD to test out their 3D V-Cache technology, but in the end, it resulted in one of the company's most successful products ever. They simply took one of their existing Zen 3 CCDs and stuck an additional 64MB cache layer directly on top of it. Of course, how they went about achieving this was ultimately much more complex than I'm making out, but in the simplest of terms, that was the end result. In a recent revisit, I found that the 5800X 3D was 1 to 5% faster than the 12900K when configuring the Core i9 processor with high-speed DDR5 memory, or 19 to 25% faster when limiting the 12900K to the same DDR4 3600 memory that was used by the 5800X 3D. So, by this point in time, AMD had well and truly put an end to Intel's gaming dominance, offering the same or better performance at a considerably more affordable price. Then putting another feather in AMD's cap was the fact that they achieved all of this, basically everything we've spoken to date, while remaining on the exact same AM4 socket, which was released 5 years prior, 2017, as we noted at the start of this video. Meanwhile, Intel found themselves on their, it's hard to believe this is the case, but Intel found themselves on their 4th socket by this point in time. I kid you not. But as they say, all good things must come to an end. And although AMD has continued to this very day To support the binned new models on the AM4 platform, Zen 3 was the last CPU architecture that it would ever see, as Zen 4 marked the transition to the AM5 socket. The AM5 socket also saw the transition from PGA or pin grid array, where the pins are on the physical CPU, to LAN grid array or LGA, where the pins are sort of in the motherboard. It's the same socket technology used by Intel, for example. And this move allowed for better power delivery and then more pins for modern connectivity. Along with the new socket, AMD also mandated DDR5 and PCIe 5.0 support. So unlike Intel's 12th and 13th generation CPUs, which supported both DDR4 and DDR5 memory, Zen 4 required DDR5 to work. And this initially made the platform very expensive, but it did help to push the industry towards the newer, faster memory standard. Coming off the highs of the 5800X 3D to the standard Zen 4 parts like the Ryzen 5 7600X and Ryzen 7 7700X wasn't that exciting, to be honest, and with no change to core counts, the productivity performance was lacking compared to what Intel was offering at the time. Gaming performance also wasn't amazing relative to the 5800X 3D, though overall it was fairly strong. We did see a 13% improvement in IPC, along with an 800 MHz plus boost to the clock speeds, and this was thanks to the move to TSMC's 5nm node for the core dies. The L2 cache capacity was also upgraded from 512 kilobytes per core to 1 megabyte per core, and this saw parts like the 7700X receive 8 megabytes of L2 cache, whereas the 5800X 3D had just 4 megabytes. As I said, these upgrades did allow the standard 7600X and 7700X processors to match and sometimes even outpace the 5800X 3D. The 7700X was also faster than the DDR5-enabled 12900K, and of course the 7700X was using DDR5 memory, as it only supports DDR5 memory, though the DDR5 memory that it did use was clocked lower. DDR5 6000 was pretty much the sweet spot for those Zen 4 processors. Rarely could they go higher than that and maintain a 1-to-1 ratio. Truth be told, the AM5 socket didn't really get rolling until the release of the 3D V-cache-enabled 7800X 3D, which arrived 7 months later, and comfortably outclassed the Core i9 13900K for gaming, though it was much slower for productivity tasks, and this is where the 7950X and 7950X 3D took over. By this point, AMD had also introduced the 65-watt non-X parts like the Ryzen 5 7600 and Ryzen 7 7700, so the AM5 rollout was well underway. Now, for new system builders, it was a pretty great option, but for those who were already invested in AM4, there really wasn't enough on offer by AM5 to justify a platform upgrade. Even if we look at our updated testing, you can see that the 7700X is still rubbing shoulders with the 5800X 3D, and that is a part AMD is rumoured to be bringing back soon, something I'm sure has many AM4 owners very excited, so fingers crossed that actually happens. Now, when compared to the DDR5-enabled 12900K, the 7700X is just 5 to 7% faster. So while it is faster for gaming, it's really not much faster, and in reality they are very comparable. So with almost a dozen retail AM5 models to pick from by this point in time, there was already a wide range of options available, from your affordable 7500F all the way up to the 7950X 3D. In the end, I think it's fair to say Zen 4 was a success for AMD. It was certainly a slow start, but it turned into a dominant victory that eventually propelled AMD to record-breaking market share by late 2025. Initially, Zen 4 was seen as a bit of a tough sell. In early 2023, reports from major retailers showed that Zen 4 was being outsold by the previous generation, Zen 3, by a ratio of nearly 5 to 1. The Ryzen 7 5800X 3D remained so good and so affordable that many gamers chose to stay on the older AM4 platform rather than upgrade to the 7000 series. And this was one of the reasons why AMD has been so reluctant to bring that thing back. As a side note, the Zen 4 architecture also spanned the Ryzen 8000 series, mostly featuring APU models with Zen 4 cores and then RDNA 3 graphics. And the key models here included the Ryzen 5 8500G, the Ryzen 5 8600G, and the Ryzen 7 8700G. We also got some binned versions without the iGPU enabled, like the 8700F and 8400F. Now, all models featured a cut-down 16 MB L3 cache, so performance, particularly for gaming, wasn't amazing. And really, for the most part, you were better off skipping them in favour of the fully fledged Ryzen 7000 parts. And that all brings us to AMD's most recent release, the Ryzen 9000 series based on the Zen 5 architecture. And unfortunately, this latest generation has been AMD's weakest offering since first introducing the original Zen architecture way back in 2017, which was 7 years prior to the initial introduction of the Zen 5 architecture. Whereas previous generations typically delivered IPC gains somewhere in the region of 10 to 20%, Zen 5 was, well, less than that. The gains are claimed to be around 15%, but it is highly workload dependent. For gaming, Zen 5 was typically reported to be around 5% faster on average when compared to Zen 4, quickly earning it the name Zen 5%. The 9700X, for example, clocked just 2% higher than the 7700X, so couple that with the weak IPC gains and no other tangible performance advantages to speak of, and you end up with single-digit gains. And those weak gains after 2 years were just part of the issue. The 9700X was also much more expensive, coming in at over a 20% premium. That unfortunately, though, wasn't the full extent of the issues. Unlike its predecessor, the 7700X, which launched with a 105 watt TDP, the 9700X launched with a 65 watt TDP. This made it incredibly easy to cool and very efficient, though it did lead some to believe that it was significantly more power efficient than it really was, as some believed it consumed 40% less power for slightly better performance. But in reality, for core heavy productivity workloads, power usage dropped by around 10% for a 2% increase in performance, meaning power efficiency had certainly improved, but not by 40%, maybe 15%. So again, certainly not nothing, but also a very disappointing improvement after 2 years, and it certainly didn't come anywhere near justifying the price premium. Not only that, but power efficiency when gaming went virtually unchanged, and in some examples, the 9700X was less efficient than the 7700X. All of this was pretty disappointing, but what would come next from AMD left us pretty baffled. AMD's handling of the disappointed Zen 5 reviews can be best described as a masterclass in how not to handle a product launch. What was really supposed to be a victory lap for AMD, they kind of won by default as Intel was struggling with their numerous stability issues, turned into a PR nightmare. It involved things like recalls, contradictory data, condescending blog posts, and blaming the operating system. Just days before the original July 2024 launch, AMD issued a global recall of all Ryzen 9000 units already sitting in warehouses. They officially cited quality expectations, but it was later revealed to be a packaging typo. Some Ryzen 7 chips were labelled as Ryzen 9. I've made that mistake on a few graphs myself, but we won't talk about that. Anyway, as a result, the launch was delayed by 2 weeks. While the typo was seen as a minor problem, it signaled to reviewers and I suppose the general public that the launch was pretty rushed and disorganized. But oh boy, little did we know that was just the tip of the iceberg. When reviews finally went live in August, the sentiment was pretty universal, that being it was underwhelming. Reviewers found the 9700X was only around 3% faster on average when compared to the 7700X for gaming, and that includes myself. Yet, despite the vast majority of reviewers all being on the same page reporting similar findings, AMD pushed back, claiming their own internal testing showed double-digit gains, somewhere in the range of 10 to 15%. This created a sort of weird he said, she said situation between AMD and us reviewers. AMD essentially applied that reviewers were testing the chips incorrectly. AMD made a blog post on their official website, which opened up by explaining that the PC ecosystem is complex, with thousands of variables, suggesting that this is why reviewers got different data to that of AMD. Except, as I said, almost all reviewers saw similar margins, despite the testing conditions changing different games, different hardware configurations, all that sort of stuff. And not only that, but quite humorously, in the same blog post, AMD eventually had to walk back their own marketing claims, revising the original 6% faster than Intel claim down to parity, which still isn't even true. The 14900K, even with the latest BIOS revisions, is still around 6% faster than the 9700X. Now, you might think at this point AMD should just quit while they're well behind. But no, this is AMD we're talking about here. So, as the drama continued to escalate, AMD just pivoted, blaming Microsoft Windows for the poor review scores. This led us to do further investigation, looking into AMD's claimed administrator bug. Apparently Zen 5 suffered from a specific issue with Windows branch prediction, and in order to see the true performance, AMD claimed reviewers needed to run Windows in a hidden administrator account mode. This claim was met with mockery from the tech community, and many of us were quick to point out that normal users would never use a hidden administrator account to get the advertised performance. But we of course investigated anyway, and while there were some performance gains, they were applied equally to other CPUs like those of the Zen 4 generation, meaning Zen 5 didn't improve relative to Zen 4. Now, to AMD's credit, they worked with Microsoft to backport a branch prediction fix for Windows 11. The catch, however, being that while the update did improve Zen 5 performance by a further 5 to 10% in some games, it also improved Zen 4 and even Zen 3 performance. The irony being that because the update helped the older chips, the gap between the 9700X and those older chips like the cheaper 7700X, it stayed roughly the same. The 9700X didn't look any better relative to the competition, everything just got a bit faster. In the end, I think it's fair to say Zen 5 wasn't a great release for desktop users. General usage was barely improved, and even today, benchmarking the 9700X with the updated 105 watt TDP mode, it's just 4% faster than the 7700X in our testing. So as I predicted in my day one review, the standard Zen 5 parts would only become worth buying, and therefore grow in popularity, once they roughly hit pricing parity with the existing Zen 4 parts, and this was achieved some time ago now. Despite the Zen 5% memes and the initial sales being incredibly weak, the 9800X 3D was really well received. And this is in spite of the fact that it is just single digits faster than the 7800X 3D, and therefore generally worse in terms of value. But as the world's fastest gaming CPU, many gamers simply couldn't get enough of the 9800X 3D. Though I've been told sales for the 9900X 3D and 9950X 3D have been pretty weak. More recently, we received the 9950X 3D 2 Dual Edition CPU. So the dual 3D V-Cache CCD version of the 9950X 3D. It's a pretty underwhelming product. It has a ridiculous price tag, so based on that, it should sell really well. Looking past Zen 5 to the future, we're expecting Zen 6 either later this year or early next year. Codenamed Morpheus, it is shaping up to be one of the more significant architectural shifts than the evolutionary Zen 5, I suppose you could say. While official details are still emerging, we're mostly dealing with leaks here, but there have been some roadmap updates which provide a fairly clear picture of what to expect. In some good news for upgraders, Zen 6 has been confirmed to continue using the AM5 socket, though you will almost certainly require a BIOS update, but that's easy enough to do, and existing 600 and 800 series boards should be able to support these upcoming CPUs with no issues at all. Zen 6 is being described as a ground-up redesign rather than a refinement. It's going to utilize TSMC's 2nm node, and that's for the CPU cores, so the CCDs, and I think it'll use like a 3nm node for the I/O die. For the first time since Zen 2 though, AMD is expected to increase the core count and L3 cache per chiplet. The leaks are suggesting 12 cores per CCD with 48 megabytes of L3 cache, allowing for a flagship 24-core, 48-thread desktop processor. And given what we've been hearing about Intel's next-generation Nova Lake CPUs, AMD really does need to increase the core count. Early engineering targets suggest Zen 6 parts to reach clock speeds of 6.3 to 6.4 GHz, and there has been some optimistic rumors even suggesting 7 GHz. Not sure about that one. But combined with the projected 10 to 15% IPC gain, single-threaded performance should see a massive jump. Native support for fast DDR5 8000 memory is also expected, along with a move towards Chiplet 2.0, which uses 2.5D/3D packaging to significantly reduce latency between the cores and memory. So there's a lot to get excited about based on what we've been hearing. And this is true not just for AMD's next generation CPUs, but also Intel's. So yeah, that's at least some good news. I'm excited. Can't wait to see what we get later in the year. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. My voice is pretty worn out at this point, so hope it was all worth it. If you liked the video, you know what to do. Subscribe. We also have the join button or Patreon. Signing up to either one of those things will give you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, Q&A stuff, and behind-the-scenes content. So check that out if you're interested. If not, that is perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.